Hello, everybody. Today's a special kind of colloquium and a very special personal delight for me to have Ron Milo here to give us the budget of our planet. Ron did his bachelor in LBO program at Hebrew University in 1996. In 1999, he finished his master's in Tel Aviv University in electrical engineering. And then went to Weizmann, worked with Uri Alon, and got his PhD, for which he got the Kennedy Award. He then moved to Harvard as a system biology fellow, and in 2008 he moved to Weizmann Institute, where he's now an associate professor. He won many awards that I really don't want to list all of them, but some interesting ones. In 1990 he won the Israel Physics Olympiad. That's a long time ago. He, for his PhD, got many awards: the Israeli Parliament Award, the Kennedy that we mentioned, the Korofas International Award, the Hellinger Memorial Prize. He got the Alon Fellowship when he came back here, and the Weizmann Institute Secretary Council Award. He's been known around the Institute and beyond for mentoring young PIs and initiating the young PIs forums, and he's the head of the Israeli Young Academy of Sciences. On a personal note, 20 years ago approximately, we were in the army and we were riding somewhere in the desert, and we wanted to have a campfire. So some of us noted that there was a piece of wood lying on the ground somewhere. Really, there is nothing else but that piece of wood. He said, okay, we'll take that and use that for a campfire. And then Ron stopped us and explained to us in length about the ecosystem, and that was, we were quite amused with the explanations at the time, but Ron took it a lot more seriously, as we will now demonstrate. So thank you for coming here.
Did you have fire?
So I actually don't have a very good recollection of what we eventually did.
But it was a very beautiful place. It was an acacia tree. There were good reasons not to burn what was there. So thanks all for coming. I was thinking, it's customary to say, as I was stepping in, say it's a pleasure to be here. And I don't know if I should say a pleasure, but as I was stepping in, I saw that on the room next door, there is the test in statistical mechanics. It's definitely in comparison. I'd rather be here in the colloquium than I was just opening. I saw the first line was about an Ising model. I flipped the page. It was renormalization. I said, okay, there's a constants of nature, and I'd better be here. And the second thing that happened to me as I was just about to put my presentation is that I noted, just like I always remember sitting here in the audience, and I remember it's like a huge auditorium, lots of people, very important, interesting things. And I was stepping here and I felt like you come back to your school and you see that everything is like really small. So with that, I'll tell you what I'll be presenting today is the work that one of the efforts that we're doing in the lab of like doing a census of life on Earth. It's not exactly physics, but to me, it's sort of like the sort of thing that, my preparation, the way of thinking of the world as a physicist, I think that connects very much to what you'll see done here. Okay, and what are we going to hear about? So hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to go back to your families and be able to answer the question of what do we have more in the world in terms of mass? Is it more plants, animals, fungi, bacteria? Where is it located? Is it in the oceans? Is it in the air? Is it some deep down in the surface? What is the impact of us, humanity, on the biosphere in quantitative terms? And really, in general, the emphasis is really not just knowing this more than that, but really trying to put numbers behind that. And I guess here I'm preaching to the choir, so there's no need to repeat that. But really, being able to know the numbers could give you sort of like a sixth sense in order to understand things more deeply. And anyone who's interested to see how this is being used in the context of biology, cell biology, ecology, etc. There's also a book that touches on that was written with Professor Rob Phillips from Caltech, a physicist and also somebody who's into that kind of perspective on the world. So far, so good? in general, I would say, I usually hope that at least 80% of the people understand 80% of what I'm saying. But here it's like the physics faculty, so it should be 99 point something. If something wasn't clear in what I was saying, I don't want to be speaking in some jargon that's unclear, feel free to interrupt me throughout. And so even though I'll be presenting the stuff here, I should give note of Yinon Baron, who's really the hero behind this, who's also sitting here in the audience. And he really is the courageous person that took this upon his master's and now PhD. And as you see, you'll need some courage in order to try and tackle that. And so what we'll be trying to explore, so for many decades, biologists have been looking in the world and trying to also make order in it. And usually the emphasis in terms of trying to say how much or how many would be on this part, species. So people have been documenting different types of beetles and trying to quantify how many different species there are. And that taught us a lot in terms of how life evolved, evolution, different biomes, all sorts of other insights into ecology. And I would say that's most of where the emphasis was put. But then there's other perspectives in which how to use this metric in order to quantify, and that you can look, for example, the number of individuals or the mass of different types of animals or plants or other things. And we're doing both, but I'll mostly be focusing on mass. And that is because that is highly relevant for if you want to know things about flows of energy or stocks of carbon that otherwise would be in our atmosphere and affecting our climate. And in terms of other elements, mass is really something that gives you quite an important perspective and surprisingly got relatively little attention. Okay, so that's what, when I'll be talking about more or how much, I'll be focusing on the metric of mass. And if you're interested in something else, we also have values for other kind of metrics. What would we like to quantify? We like to quantify everything, but often people talk in terms of kingdoms of life. So what are the kingdoms of life? So there's bacteria, which I guess you know, and there's like their very old cousins called archaea that if you've never heard about, that's fine. You could think about them just like as another kind of bacteria, but they're pretty interesting. There's protists, which you might not have heard about as well. Just one second, yeah?
Just about the metrics. If you look at mass, so for example, one human is like 20 rabbits. Would we have the same flows of carbon dioxide towards? Or is it different? Does it matter that we're one human versus 20 rabbits?
Yeah.
Is it the correct thing to look at is mass?
Right. So in terms of like, if you're interested, say, in the carbon content, the fraction that's within carbon, as well as most other, the stoichiometry of elements, is usually relatively constant, obviously not completely constant. So in that respect, if you have the same mass of rabbits and the same mass of people, usually you would have, within the uncertainty involved, and we could discuss that, you'll have the same amount of carbon and other elements.
Yeah.
In terms of the flux of consumption, say, of energy, etc., there's all sorts of scaling laws, allometric relations that you can start to analyze, and then that wouldn't be a constant. But you probably would like to have a value of the mass in order to proceed in doing that analysis, rather than just tell me the number of rabbits and the number of people and be able to infer something about energy flow from that. So in any case, I think that's a useful metric. Okay, so these protists are also some single cell organisms that you might not know so much about, but plants you probably know. Fungi are those things that usually not necessarily look like mushrooms, but also make our beer and wine and other stuff, and then animals. So these are like the kind of kingdoms we'd like to quantify. And there's one kingdom in which we would like to get even further. What kingdom would be most interesting to you? Okay, so I have bacteria, plants, animals. It's interesting. When you give that, like say in biology, everybody say, exactly, of course, protists are the most important, or archaea are the most important. Each one, the things that they study are the most interesting for them, and that's fair. So, it is close to us, so we are looking at animals even further, and there are all sorts of different names of taxa, which you might not have heard about, but we're sitting down here in chordates, and we'll talk about some other ones as well.
Why are viruses not included?
We're actually also doing viruses. They're just not defined as a kingdom by itself. We also have viruses, don't worry. Yeah.
Is there is it arbitrary for us, or is it important why these are the way to separate things?
This is the way the tree of life was defined, based on all sorts of evidence. There's also been, with the molecular revolution, there's been some rehashing of this, but it's not very intuitive and not how much of the previous literature is involved. So I don't think you need to care so much about that. But basically, yes, these are the kind of how the tree of life evolved. And to some people, that means really a lot, but you don't have to worry about it so much. Okay, what are the units we'll be working in? Obviously, units are important, so we'll be using units of gigatons of carbon. So I don't need to say here, but sometimes I read like giga 10 to the 9, tons of carbon. We're looking at carbon as a metric because that's very often what's being measured in the literature, but it's easy to convert into other units. And just intuitively, a gigaton of carbon is like a cube, a kilometer by kilometer by kilometer, filled with something with a density of 1. And that's about roughly what the humanity eats like in a year or so, just if you want some other. And that's important both for things like how things were measured, but also in terms of biogeochemical cycles, meaning how there is a flow of elements in the world. Carbon is very interesting, and therefore we're focusing on that. Okay, let's take a simple concrete example. Say we wanted to put all of humanity on a weight and see what do you get. So obviously we just need to take the mass of a person, the number of people, and you get a value. So the average person weighs about 50 kilos, right? I don't know if it works in this room, and it's not because I'm on a crazy diet. What is the reason?
Kids.
Right, so you take the whole distribution, there's adults, there's children, and then you do get about 50 kilos for the average. We're about 2/3 water, so we're left with 1/3 of that, and then about, to pretty close approximation, half of our dry weight is carbon and half is all the rest. And then if you multiply that, you get 10 kilograms. Sometimes I'm being asked, is it that in my department we don't know how to multiply accurately? Because if you really take 1/3 of that, multiply by half, you get like 8 point something. And then I need to explain to them that given the uncertainty that's involved, and in any case I'm trying to do a back of the envelope order of magnitude calculation, it's fine to do this rounding, and I guess it's fine in this audience to do that. So I have that amount. So each of you is like 10 kilograms of carbon, if you're interested to know. There's about 7.7 billion people. If you take it as 10 to the 10, you get about 0.1 gigaton of carbon when you convert it to the units that we talked about. So now you can tell, what happens if you take all of humanity, try to put them in a box. But that's not something that's so fun to think about. But you get the idea of the units involved. Okay, so far so good. Okay, I wish everything was as simple as that. I will probably, although we would run out of business. Because humanity is sort of almost the only thing for which you can do that. Because let's take some other example. Let's say you want to do it for insects, which are part of this thing called arthropods, פרוקי רגליים. And then it's a problem because there's no such thing as the characteristic, what's the mass of the characteristic insect. And nobody still knows, 2019, nobody knows how many insects there are in the world. And obviously I can't multiply two numbers that I don't have a value for each of them. And that just conveys the challenge of trying to do that, and maybe something about the fact that 2000, we just published it, but so 2018, there wasn't such a global survey, even though you would have thought that science was supposed to already do that. Okay, so that's kind of the challenge involved. So let me give you the methodology in which we're trying to approach that, and that's kind of the toughest slide, if there is a tough slide in this presentation. So how are we trying to approach this? So say you're interested to know the mass of all the fish in the world. So you're not getting a permit to go and do a fishing expedition to take all of the fish out of the oceans and weigh them. You need to find an alternative. So you go and fish the literature, and you find many, many studies that have been looking at different locations in the oceans, at different depths, at different times of the year, averaged over something. You get some values for many, many different locations. And now you need to find a way in order to extrapolate from the values that you have to all the other locations in the world for which you don't have values.
They are far from uniform, they're close to average.
You traveled around the world, right, Shimon?
Yeah.
It's very diverse, yeah. It's very diverse. It could be orders of magnitude.
Those are the big world.
Yeah, it's a big world. Yes, so there is
You're saying that there is really a distribution is what?
distribution.
Biomass distribution of fishes.
Yeah, very wide. For example, the
There are
Mediterranean.
places there are no fishes, and there are places where there are lots of fishes.
Right, so it varies definitely with locations. For example, the Mediterranean, much of it is relatively poor in terms of biomass. And that's because of all sorts of things related actually to this elemental composition. Like we lack phosphorus and nitrogen in the water, and therefore the whole food pyramid usually does not supply enough in order for some fish, although some locations would be different. So there's lots of variability. Unfortunately, there's no homogeneity principle, nothing that we could use of that sort. Okay, so we have that value for different locations. How would we extrapolate from the known values to locations that we haven't measured? So we need to find a way in order to correlate it to something. So ideally, we'd like to correlate it into environmental parameters which have been measured widely. So what would you think are environmental parameters that would dictate, say, the mass of fish in some locations? So temperature, salinity, oxygen content, right? So these kind of things, solar radiation, distance from the closest shore, the depth of the water. And so people have been looking at such aspects for different taxa and coming up, just like was mentioned here, sometimes it could be the type of biome, kind of like is it a Mediterranean something or is it an Arctic location? And with that, people have been looking for the best correlations they could find between those environmental parameters and the densities. And it doesn't have to be a 1D correlation. It could be several parameters, and you can do it with different types of sets for which you found that there's good predictions, and then you can repeat the calculation in different methods, and from that infer something about the uncertainty involved, because there's definitely not perfect correlations here. But the nice thing is that once you have these simple mathematical relations, now the value for those environmental parameters, as you know, have been measured, by NASA scientists or some other remote sensing or whatever. So we have distribution for most of those parameters, be it salinity, temperature, sunlight, distance from the shore, or whatever. And now it's easy to extrapolate based on this relationship and those values for each and every different location. And this you just need to integrate and you'll get a global estimate. Okay, so that's the logic of what would guide us here. And again, of course, you'll know that this wouldn't be perfect, because this mathematical relationship is a simplification, because you have a limited sparseness in terms of the number of points that have been looked at. But you can try and repeat it in different ways and try to get some estimate into the uncertainty involved. And that's what we'll try to do.
How many experiments approximately?
Yeah, so it really varies by taxa. Can you give some characteristic values?
Like, for example, yeah. What is it? How many data?
So it really varies based on for example, for things in the ocean, for plankton, there's like millions of points throughout like the last 50 years. But for other stuff, there's like several dozen. So it can vary very significantly, and the uncertainty will change based on the.
Yeah, so in some cases, so if you're looking for a plankton, you'll have cruises in which, they're putting some buoys and, collecting things and measuring them on site, and they'll be doing it like every hour. And then, with so many cruises, you have millions of data points. For other things, like, it could be just dozens of points. So yeah, it's a mess in that respect, going back to variability. But then again, I think it's much better to have an order of magnitude or some value with some uncertainty than not knowing anything. Okay, so I think we're ready for some results. So let's go back to the first question. I'm a big believer in active participation to see that you're still all with me. So I want to see what you're thinking. Would you say, what is the most dominating, meaning the most massive? Would it be A, bacteria, B, fungi, C, plants, or D, protists? And now you need to vote. Okay, I don't know how common it is here. So who's for the bacteria?
You too. Yeah?
I'm voting with you. So this is about two. I'm voting for everybody. This is 2/3, I guess. Who's voting for the fungi? Okay, I have some fungi guys. Excellent. Who's voting for the plants? Another third. And the protist? Nobody. Yeah, there's some. Yeah, few bold ones that are voting for the protist. Okay. Are you ready for the results? So actually, I got like a tip when I gave that lecture in some other place. If you want to build some drama before the results, you do something like this. Okay, you can try it out. It's actually pretty effective. And so, the vast majority of biomass on Earth is plants.
Is it living plants or also the ones that are already not alive?
So this is living plants. This is not like oil or like coal or something that's
Cores of trees.
no. Okay, so yeah, right. So it's all things that you'll see them standing right now. You can say, okay, maybe I don't care so much about the trunk of the tree because maybe the xylem they made. But you could take that out and it would still be more than half.
Well, is there an error estimate on this?
Oh yeah. Oh yes. So we've been spending months, or Inon was spending months, and I was spending months with him on trying to get error estimates. I'll mention some of those values soon. So most of the things I'll be showing you would be such that within the error estimates we have pretty good qualitative indication that, for example, there's definitely more plants than bacteria or other taxa here. Yeah.
The fact that plants are limited to the surface of the earth and bacteria are not doesn't work in favor of the bacteria. I mean, clearly not. But.
Okay, so that's now it's a question of how come, and you say intuitively you say bacteria could live in many different locations and there's like a volume issue. Okay, that's part of the fact that that's why I guess many of the people here were wrong. But don't worry about it. Actually, I was giving this talk at one of the best departments of biology and ecology in Princeton. And there was a larger fraction that was wrong there. So that's fair enough. Yeah, we could start talking about the mechanism and analyze why, but that's kind of like a longer discussion. Good.
Where does fish come in this?
We'll get to fish in a minute. Okay. Okay, so we got it. This is plants, and just to put it in the general context, so plants is the dominant kingdom, and then there's bacteria. Even though this is 2008. We now have been updating those values based on a big consortia that was analyzing bacteria that live in the deep subsurface. Like apropos your question, people have been looking at things at like a depth of 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 5 kilometers when they're digging for gold or for oil, taking the cores and looking at and that until when we were working on this was like the largest fraction of bacteria was living there deep in the deep subsurface. There's been a big update, like consortium of hundreds of different scientists, and we now know this value instead of 70 should be updated to about 30, which is well within our uncertainty estimates, but that means it's even more dominant than we thought before. Okay, just to show you also that this is a pretty vibrant field still today. And the other major thing is, so those who voted for fungi, they're also around here. And those who are interested in viruses, okay, 0.2 out of all this. But don't get the flu. And animals, which are here, let's look at them some more. So in a minute, just to clarify, this picture is very different, not also in the fact that you might have had a different perspective. The way biology is often discussed in terms of diversity and things like that, you usually get a depiction of life in this way, where in these textbooks they show the size of a living thing based on how many species there are. And then, insects are the big thing, and plants are okay, but then you could have all sorts of other things, but this is completely not in proportion to what we find in terms of mass. So it kind of like gives you a different perspective. Okay, somebody was asking about fish. So what would you say are the most abundant animals? Would it be arthropods is this name for insects and all sorts of crustaceans and things like that? Shrimps and... Okay, so it's arthropods, livestock, the things that we grow in order to eat them. Fish and nematodes are those worms in the soil when you dig in your garden. Okay, question is clear?
Where are men?
Men don't appear here, but you can have E would be men.
5%, you told us.
Okay, let's get to men in a minute. Okay, we'll have people coming up soon. Okay, the question is clear. Who's voting for the arthropods, insects, etc.? I guess I have about a third. Who's voting for the livestock? Bon appetit. Who's voting for the fish? And who's voting for the nematodes? Okay, so it's pretty interesting because if you take the entropy of the info, like there's quite such a diversity here. 2019, pretty educated people that consider them like respectable animals, and we don't know the answer to this kind of like basic question. It's almost like a quarter to each of the different answers. Just a point to think about. Okay, so if you're ready, these are the answers. So those who were looking into arthropods and into like the insects and into the fish, you seem to be at a good point. But let me put some remarks on that, okay? So according to our estimates, the biggest group is indeed the arthropods. but it's not the kind of flying insects that you're worried about in your, that might be coming to bite you, or mosquitoes or something like that. The biggest chunk is these things, which are called copepods. If you never heard about them, that's fine, because I never heard about them either before I started working on this. And they're like these small shrimp that are the most abundant animals in terms of mass in the world. And so if you did think about arthropods and you said about copepods, well done for you. And therefore you might be happy if you voted for fish, right? And I would say, by the way, given the uncertainty, we don't know which one is more at a good certainty, right? The uncertainty is kind of there's a big overlap. So if you voted for fish, I just need to tell you that the most abundant fish by far, like 90% and more, are these mesopelagic fish, which I don't know if you voted for, if you thought about them, because actually nobody knew about them until the Second World War. In the Second World War, the British had to find the German submarines, so they developed the sonar. They put the sonar and started working, and what they found is that the floor of the ocean went up and down every day by like a kilometer. And of course, they went back to the engineers and told them, we're in the war, fix their machine, we need to find the submarines. They tried to do what they could. They tried again, it happened again. And what it turns out, they found the mesopelagic fish. It turns out there's like these huge swarms of fish that hide in the ocean, deep in the ocean, like a depth of over a kilometer during the day, because they don't want to be eaten by predators. And then during the night, they go up vertically about a kilometer, like they go up Metzada twice or something, and then they come to eat. What do they eat? They eat the copepods, right? They eat the copepods, and before the sun rises, they flee back to the bottom of the ocean, and that's what the sonars was seeing. These huge flocks of not flocks, what is the word? Schools. Okay, anyway, so if you thought about those fish, well done for you for voting for them. And this is basically the picture of what we see in terms of animal biomass in the world. But just to be clear, all of this diverse and interesting picture is only this, which is like 0.5%, roughly less than 0.5% of the overall mass of living things on Earth. So there's basically 100 pages of supplementary material behind all of those numbers. So anybody who's interested it's also publicly available in a pretty nice way. But if you look at the uncertainty, this is 95% confidence interval, fold change for the range. It's more like a log normal distribution than normal distribution. And as you can see, for plants, it's relatively small, but for bacteria, it's pretty high, although now it's probably decreasing with the updated values that we have. And you can see there's still a lot of knowledge gaps here, but then we could still see that we could tell the orders of magnitude, so I think it's quite informative.
So are you claiming sub-percent accuracy?
What?
Are you claiming sub-percent accuracy for the plants?
20%. This is fold change. So say it's 450 gigatons of carbon, meaning you multiply and divide to get the range in terms of 95% confidence interval. Not that I'm claiming this is really a log normal distribution in a very accurate way.
It sounds to me like
what?
extreme accuracy.
Okay, we could talk about it.
Can you convince us it's better to factor off 2, let's say?
I can tell you we're doing, one thing we could do and are doing are like all sorts of sanity checks in order to try and verify that. So there's actually an ability with remote sensing to count the number of trees above some diameter. And then you can do some sanity check based on that. But what's better to do is there's different ways in order to calibrate remote sensing of the density of plant biomass. And you're doing in situ measurements on different locations. And then you're taking such completely different methodologies of doing that, and you see how much diversity you get, and you get way less than a factor of 2.
But within these numbers, bacteria can definitely be more than plants, right? I understand this factor.
Yeah, so this is like the old estimate, and now I'm telling you it's significantly smaller and the uncertainty is smaller, but you can do the distributions based on that. And what was like, there was like a 7%, what was the number?
It was like 90% plants are.
Yeah, so we could say with 90% accuracy based on, or certainty based on that value, that we have more plants mass than bacteria mass.
Bacteria, how do they get their energy? Most of them? It's
Where do they get their energy? So there's a diversity of energy sources. Some of them are photosynthetic. Some of them are not photosynthetic. Some of them are, yeah. Okay, there's interest. I like visualizing data, but other people are better than this. So this I thought just of sharing with you. People were showing what we got in terms of like if this is humans, this is the overall mass of viruses in comparison in terms of size. And then you can see the worms and the fish and the insects. And then in comparison, you should have them by that size, to show the fungi, bacteria, and plants. Just to give you an intuitive sense of what we're talking about, although the plants are not these daisies or whatever is shown here, right? These are like trees. And if you're interested in humanity, so this is plants, this is bacteria, this is everything else, and we're this dot. We're about 0.01% in terms of biomass. And now you can ask this 0.01%, that sounds kind of negligible. You could ask about the implications of humanity still on the biosphere, and that's what we're trying to look at. So say, for example, if you look at, we're mammals, Yonkim. So you could ask, what's the ratio between the mammals, all the wild mammals in the world, the giraffes, the elephants, all the other things, whales, and then the mammals that grow as livestock. If you remember, we were relating to that before. What do you have more in the world? So we asked that because we've been looking at such values and collecting that number. And this is what we're getting. This is humans, livestock, and wild mammals. Not only rhinos. This is rhinos with the whales, with the elephants, all these things. I'm reading books to my daughters. So usually there's like, a giraffe coming to visit the elephant, and they're talking about what happened to the pig. So the pig is kind of like here. But this is like a depiction of what's, how the world looks now. And even though you might enjoy, David Attenborough movies, Planet Earth, and see a wide diversity of life and, huge flocks of whatever, this is the quantitative aspect of what we have right now left in the world. And this is in the perspective of looking at mammals. You can ask it, for example, say, in relation to birds. Right? There's also these nice BBC movies when you have the camera moving out and out and out, and it seems like to be endless. So it's not completely endless. If you look in comparison, this is the wild birds, all of them together, versus the domesticated birds, mostly chicken. And it's about twice in terms of mass. And so this tells us something, and you can now also look at the overall biomass of the biosphere, all living things in the world. What happened to that since the arrival of humanity on the scene? So the short version is about half of it was lost. So the biomass right now on Earth, what I showed you so far, is about half of what it used to be. And that's mostly because we've been taking biomass in the form of, say, forest. We turned it into agriculture, which is required in order to make our food. And even though we're counting the mass of corn and wheat and potatoes and whatever that is there, this is way less than what used to be there. And therefore, it's about 50% decrease in terms of overall biomass in the world. Which might bring you to the question of, where is all this biomass located? So you understood the method already. So who's voting for, is it, say, mostly in the oceans? Who thinks it's about roughly the same? And who thinks it's mostly terrestrial? Okay, so again, we have about 1/3 in each group. And so there's about 80-fold more terrestrially, meaning on land, than in the oceans. And if you think about it, I kind of told you the answer before, right? We were talking about trees and plants as the big biomass. And actually, there are no trees in the world as far as in the ocean, as far as we counted, although you could find algae and kelps and things like that, but this is negligible in terms of biomass.
Can I go back to your previous claim about what humans done to plants? Yes, so you said that humans reduce by a factor of 2.
Yes.
So right now it's like the mass of humans is negligible compared to the number of plants. And I would guess that the mass of whatever agriculture we're doing is similar to the mass of humans. So how come? Because I said the mass of humans is negligible compared to the number of plants.
Yeah. So First, I would say I think the mass of the agriculture, because you have to grow it for a while, say a season of a few months, and you're consuming more than your mass. But in terms of the factor between the mass of agriculture and the biomass that used to be there before, you could easily get a factor of say 100.
So
In terms of like the forest that used to be there, you will go here out in the fields, and like if you had an oak.
like the implication is like factor of 2 more humans and no more plants on Earth.
That would be an oversimplification that I think would not drive them. So much of it is would now be driven by getting higher yields from the same plots of land. But yeah, if we were taking if we're doing it carelessly, which we sometimes do as well, yeah, we could get into the situation where we'll remove much more than 50% of our biomass, because if we'll cut down many of the left rainforests, etc., probably some of the forests we won't touch because they're in boreal locations and you can't grow your food there.
So this factor of 2 since humanity appeared, that wasn't linear in time, I assume. So
Right.
you estimate, was that a consequence of the last 100 years, 200 years?
We're
1,000?
working hard on trying to do that. I was hoping to. It's tougher, there wasn't here nobody to take good measurements, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. There's all sorts of proxies you can use in order to be able to do that, and we're trying to do that. Obviously, there's much that has been happening in the past century as population increased dramatically, but there's also a lot that's been happening before. Okay, there's a lot to be said about it, but I don't want to diverge too much before Rani tells me I'm out of time, right? How am I doing? I'm not running out of time.
They're asking questions, so we'll
Okay.
stretch it.
Okay, so we were here 80-fold more. So just to be clear, way more on land than in the oceans. And this is if anybody's interested. Now we're looking more deeply into what is the ocean composed of, but that's not critical for now. Okay, just getting to the close to the end. There's this something very known about consumers versus producers. Producers are the thing, just relying on the sun in order to do photosynthesis and things like that, the base of the food pyramid. And consumers are all the parasites that depend on them, that come to eat the food before getting into the seminar, and all the things that like us, as well as all the other things that are not using sunlight but rather eat other things. And ecologists have been working hard on thinking about the relationships between producers and consumer, the flow of energy, etc. And they came up with something probably that wouldn't surprise you, because your children are studying it in elementary school, and if not in junior high school, about the food pyramid, right? There's like this rule of thumb that you have about 10-fold ratio between what's known as trophic level, like one base in the pyramid, to the next level. Okay, so something cute that we thought about, we already collected all of that information. We could go back to the pyramid and try to put numbers on that and see. It's hard for us to know all the levels, but let's say the base, the producers versus all the consumers. Okay, the idea is clear? Okay, and we did that, and this is what we got on land terrestrially. And you get about 450 gigatons of carbon of producers, trees, and other things, and all the other things above them is about 20. Okay, kind of like a pyramid. You could talk about how many levels, and there's lots that could be done about it. And then the next thing that we did is took all the oceans, took the marine environment, and we did the same thing, and this is what we got. A few fold more of consumers than producers. What do you think?
They live short.
So I see some of you a bit worried. We were worried. There's a question of what's happening here. This does not look like a pyramid. This looks like an inverse pyramid.
How can this be sustainable?
How can this be sustainable?
This is not a rate. This is the balance. The current.
It's not a balance, חד גדיא.
חד גדיא. Okay, so there could be different options. So one hypothesis is the Chad Gadya hypothesis. Now we have a good name for it to use in the literature, which says, okay, we were talking about like a pyramid, so there could be something eating something, and I was clustering or putting together all of the higher trophic levels together, so maybe come of that. But if you take a sum of 1/10 plus 1/10 of 1/10, you wouldn't get very far. So yeah, you could do that analysis. Had Gadya, I think, mathematically wouldn't give you. Okay, any other suggestions?
Dark matter.
Dark. Okay. I'm happy to write a joint paper that we discover dark matter. I was always looking forward to doing that. Yeah.
So maybe the division between terrestrial and marine doesn't make sense.
Meaning?
If you combine them together, it kind of looks like a pyramid.
Okay, so if you put them together, it would still look like a pyramid. That's fair. But it could be something else you're hinting at. Like one suggestion talks about, if we had Had Gadya hypothesis, also like a subsidy hypothesis that says maybe the land is subsidizing the consumers in the oceans. Meaning, the river deltas, they bring lots of nutrients and other good stuff. And there's, birds that, eat things there and then come to die in the ocean and then they're being consumed. There could be all sorts of things that you're getting it's called subsidies from the, and it's been running in the literature for a while now. You could try and constrain that again with numbers. And you can see it could be a relevant aspect, but nothing enough in order to explain what you're getting here. And also we think there's a simpler explanation.
Well, if the error bar you have there is 100-fold like you had before, then that one could easily be 10.
Yeah, it could. I'm saying in theory it could. Now, there's people who've been looking at trying to estimate those fluxes moving from the land into the ocean.
No, I'm just talking the marine. If you look at the producers, if there's another factor of 10 or so fold error bar on it,
okay,
you're okay.
Okay, yes. So you want to go on the error. So I think we have good reasons to think that the errors, the uncertainty involved would not flip this pyramid.
They live very short time.
Okay, that's the problem. Rani had the answer I just said it, so I took it some time so we could say it. So, okay, what Rani suggests is maybe there's something with the turnover, like how long do they live? Okay, so trying to expand on what Rani is suggesting. Think about the producers versus the consumer in the marine environment. The producers, there'll be like this thing called phytoplankton or plankton or all sorts of other things. They usually live for a pretty short period of time. They're being consumed after a day or a week. So on the average, that would have a turnover of about a few days.
Consumed or perish?
So there's a significant fraction that's being consumed, a significant fraction that's being perished. Some of them, the viruses that Elisha was referring to, are causing them to perish. There's different mechanisms.
But their lifetime?
On the average, a few days, like a week.
Real natural lifetime? No?
Natural. Not, we're not talking about lab conditions here. This is like real world situations on the average. The consumers, on the other hand, they're integrating over a much longer period of time, months, years. And then, as you can see, in terms of flux of energy, of biomass, you could still have the ratio of 10 to 1 or whatever, such that there's much more of flux here than here in the producers than of the consumers. But that does not mean that the standing stock, which is the integral over the turnover time, would be the same. And actually, if this is integrating over a much longer period of time, you'll have much more standing stock. Okay? What am I telling you? I'm telling you that if we had these two pictures of pyramids, I'm not saying it's all wrong. I'm saying in terms of the flow of energy or biomass, in terms of flux, that still holds. But a depiction that says that that's also true in terms of the mass of snails and turtles and fish versus the kelps here, that does not hold true when you look globally. Thanks, Ali.
And is there a good explanation why things are inverted on land and in sea in terms of lifetime?
Yeah, so the mechanism behind it, that's, there's no easy way. I think we have one hypothesis, but it could be other hypotheses. It's not easy to build, an Earth and test different alternatives. But think about the physical constraints on land and in the ocean. On land, the primary source of energy for the producers is sunlight. And now you have competition among the different players. In order to reach the sunlight, the strategy most often taken by producers on land is to try and reach the sunlight to become higher than your competitors in order to reach the sunlight. And therefore you get trees and you get tree trunks and you get a lot of mass in order to give a robust structure that goes as high as possible. If you take the same strategy and try to apply it in the marine environment, you will sink to the bottom and not get any photons. And therefore this is not a viable strategy. And thus it's a competition not on how big you are, how much mass you have, and by that you'll win the competition, but on other things. So I think that's a reasonable hypothesis. I don't have a good proof to show that it's not hand waving, but okay, before my time is out, I'll say, so just one fun thing, I know fun, but something we're working on right now. You understood that we have an information about the biomass, and we kind of have something also a long time, just like Roy was interested in. And that made us think there's another thing, and that is what's known as anthropomass, meaning all the mass that we humanity produce, not living things. What would that be? It would be the new chemistry building that will be built on campus. It would be your houses. It would be roads. It would be cell phones, all of the things that were produced by humanity. And as you can imagine, this is a graph, if you do it temporally, that increases pretty fast, exponentially in some way or another.
But that's not carbon.
So we could do it. If you want, you could do carbon, you can do dry mass, you can do wet mass, whatever you like. Choose your metric. And then I was taught that when you have two graphs, one of them like biomass, which is kind of like constant, maybe even decreasing with time, and one that is rapidly increasing, it made me think that at some point in time, we'll be in a situation that we'll have more mass on Earth that has been produced by humanity than all living things combined. And so the question is, so what? We'll talk later, but over lunch, if you'll buy me. But now I first want to ask you the question: this Gedanken experiment. When would that happen? Okay, the question is clear. At what point in time would we have more mass produced by us, humanity on Earth, than all the living mass on Earth? Anybody wants to guess?
Already did.
6 months?
Because we produce
It's a very cynical crowd here, not very...
Because we will produce more because that will decrease.
Okay, so let's see what we have right now. So in green you see the biomass. This is all the biomass. This is all the anthropomass. And this is waste. And then you can see the other thing. This is like concrete, aggregates that are being used. Asphalt is used to make roads, bricks, and then some other things like metals, wood, glass, etc. And you can see that if you take the overall mass in terms of this is dry mass for your question, it's already been happening. If you want to do it by you don't care about waste so much because that somehow got back into the system, so that's roughly now. And if you want to do it by wet mass, which I think has good reasons as well, then we're approaching that. It's in the coming 10 years that we have this point of transition. And if you want to see it figuratively in another way, this is like if you compare the overall mass of plastic versus animals on Earth, or the overall mass of buildings versus trees.
What is the wet mass?
Wet mass is actually when you make, for example, when you build a house and you make concrete, you're actually adding to the cement water. Some of it evaporates and some of it does not evaporate. And so you can take that into account as well. Just in order to make it a fair comparison to the trees which are wet. So we're saying, and that... Okay, so that's roughly what I wanted to tell you. Just to show some of the things that we're following up from here is like I was just telling you about the human mass versus natural biomass. We're looking at the question of Roy, how did that change in Earth's history? So that's together with we're actually looking for the last 3 billion years, not just the last 10,000 years. There's a mass in the ocean. We're looking at the mass of the atmosphere. You can try and and do a game with your friends or family. What do you have most in the air? Is it birds? Is it spores of fungi? Is it pollen from trees? Is it bacteria? Is it viruses again? Or maybe it's even people in airplanes.
When did the birds count? Like
Only while they're flying? Or?
Yeah, so you can try and do it in different ways. But if you want to do a Fermi problem, you can try and look at the people in airplanes versus some other thing you're interested in and see what comes out. Anyway, there's other things, wild mammals, arthropods, etc. And about the so what, just to finish with that, I think it's all like giving you like kind of like a different perspective on studying the living world and the effect of humanity on the composition of the world. It enables us to revisit things that usually have been studying in local locations, like the food pyramid. Usually it's being studied, by some ecologists in their nature reserve or whatever, and here you can try and get a more general picture. And what we're doing is kind of like a step towards what is kind of like the overarching goal of like quantifying fluxes of energy and matter in the biosphere, and that's tough to do in a complete manner, but this is part of that effort. Lots of people has been helping into that. Yinon is really being the hero behind it, and this is only part of what we do. So if you're curious about more, you can come and visit some other people in the Benozio building and see we're working on hard and trying to take carbon dioxide from the air and bring it back into either food or fuels using biology. So that's for a different colloquium. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. We have time for even more questions.
So when was peak biomass? It seemed like there was just and what did it only happen once? Sorry.
Yeah, so that relates very much to this thing that we're doing, where there's like this amazing postdoc that came from Princeton that's working together with Itai Halevi in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, and they have interesting methods in order to try and estimate the biomass and fluxes way back based on isotope fractionations of oxygen, carbon, phosphorus. And from that, there's ways to try and use that as proxies in order to see the overall biomass. And my original picture was thinking that, that the peak was recent, but actually it now turns out it might have been way more in periods of time, way back, like hundreds of million years ago, when the average temperature on Earth was about 5 to 10 degrees higher than it is today. And then there was the continents, which was spreading not exactly like they now because of plate tectonics that were located differently, but you could have forest also in the poles, and there's indications for that using pollen and other things. And then it seems like the overall biomass on Earth was actually much more, not only much more than it is now after we decreased it by a factor of 2, but maybe twofold higher than what it was before we started to get into the scene. But all of this is like work in progress that we're now doing, and how many such peaks there were in the history of Earth, I really don't know. I don't know if we'll know at a reasonable time.
All right, one before last.
For the next planets, my question is, how can you detect that from far?
Again, how?
Can you detect all this biomass from far away?
Do you mean far away in time or far away in remote sensing?
Different subsystems. How can we detect other biomasses in other planets?
Okay. So we're talking. Okay, so this thing. Okay, this is pretty far. So this whole field called astrobiology, which deals with trying to combine not exactly the kind of astrophysics you're doing here, but trying to see what can you tell. And so there's people looking at so photosynthesis has this kind of fingerprint in terms of looking at the spectra. Say you wanted to detect whether there is or there isn't life on Earth, and you were looking from afar, you could detect in the spectra of the reflected light the effect of so many plants doing photosynthesis, and therefore the lines of absorption, you could use that. And there's this characteristic wavelengths from, I think, it reaches up to 690 nanometers, and then you see some transition there. And that is being used in order to try and also think if there was photosynthesis with similar principles, maybe you can infer something based on that. Obviously, if there's a different type of life, maybe you're just not looking for that wavelength transition, just looking for some abrupt transition that is not related to anything that we know from physics in terms of spectroscopy. So there's all sorts of efforts like that. I don't know of anybody who tried to even, to go even further and say not only whether there is life or there isn't life. So far, we don't have indications of life. To say, no, I don't care if there is life or there isn't life. That's a boring question. I want to know how much life there is. When we'll get, that would be, I'm looking for that day to arrive.
Last question.
I had a thought about when you showed the story of the pyramids, the inverted pyramid in this. So let me find if my interpretation is right. In the sea, you're actually observing the surplus of producers which have not yet been eaten. So in a sense, I wonder if it's not too much of a finalistic interpretation. The producers on Earth are evolutionarily very successful because they don't get eaten soon enough. I wonder if there is something of this kind you could say, or how could you explain that you see so much producers on the Earth and not on the sea?
Okay, so I would say what you're saying is one way to interpret things, and I think we could spend time, again, talking about such interpretations. I'm kind of like I'm most interested in just giving a good, honest picture of what we know and the uncertainty involved with it. And the interpretation, that could take us very far. I don't have any answer to your interpretation. This is one interpretation. I was mentioning some other thing that might be the mechanism behind it.
All right. Thank you all.